1996, obsessed fan Ricardo Lopez mailed a letter bomb to the home of Icelandic singer Björk. He then shot himself on camera, hoping that he and Björk would be united in heaven. But a few days later, police found his body along with his video diaries, and the package was intercepted. After his mother died in 2013, Arizona man Jim Stauffer donated her body for scientific research. He later found out that her corpse was instead sold to the US military for $6,000 and blown up at a bomb testing site. In 2015, British woman Amanda Plale began receiving threatening emails from a stalker which included photos of her in public. She was terrorized for 2 straight years and was soon too afraid to even leave her home. Luckily, authorities eventually discovered that the emails were coming from inside her own house. Turns out it was her loving husband the entire time. Shortly after returning from the moon, Buzz Aldrin fell into deep depression and addiction. He was quoted saying, "I wanted to resume my duties, but there were no duties to resume. There was no goal, no sense of calling, no project worth pouring myself into." Police in Pakistan are searching for a religious healer who reportedly convinced a pregnant woman that hammering a 2-inch nail into her skull would help her give birth to a boy. The woman became desperate after her husband threatened to divorce her if she gave birth to another girl for the 4th time. Lucy Studi from Iowa claims that her late father was a serial killer who murdered up to 70 women throughout the 70s and 80s. She told authorities that the man forced his kids to help bury the bodies, many of them thrown into a well that's since been filled in. Police aren't exactly sure how to approach it, especially since Lucy's sister says she's lying about the whole thing. Japan has always been known for its wacky game shows, but in 1998, one particular show took this to the extreme. A man nicknamed Nasubi was selected to be locked inside of an apartment with nothing but a supply of water and thousands of magazines. He was challenged to enter mail-in sweepstakes until he won about $10,000 in prizes, but he was given no food, no clothes, and no form of human contact. His only means of survival were the items he won from the magazines. The man was told it was only experimental and that he was to record himself for a later broadcast. But in reality, his entire experience was live-streamed to an audience of tens of millions of people to watch and make fun of. There were times when Nasubi went weeks without food and was fortunate to win items such as dog food and uncooked rice. On one occasion, he won a can of spaghetti after starving for days, but he couldn't eat it since he didn't have a can opener. When Nasubi would break down mentally and cry in front of the camera, the show's producers would play a laugh track to the audience so that they would find it funny. After 355 days of pure isolation and torture, Nasubi had achieved his goal, but the show had become far too popular for producers to end. So in the middle of the night, he was blindfolded and taken to a new apartment, where he was given the task of winning enough magazine prizes to win a plane ticket back home. This goal was revised several times to the point where it took Nasubi an extra 3 months to finally win the game show. He was again blindfolded and brought to a final apartment where the walls suddenly dropped and he was met with a massive live audience. Still naked and confused, Nasubi would soon realize that his endeavors were live broadcasted the entire time. The entire experiment lasted about 15 months in total, and the horrific show broke many TV records with a peak of about 17 million viewers each night. For months and even years after the ordeal, Nasubi reported being uncomfortable in clothing and struggled heavily with human interaction. This iconic photograph of 28-year-old Marcy Borders covered in dust was taken just after the World Trade Center collapsed on 9/11. Marcy was a bank teller who worked on the 81st floor of the North Tower. She survived the collapse, but sadly died from cancer in 2014, likely caused by the toxic fumes she was exposed to. This is the gravestone of H.R. Giger, the Swiss artist and sculptor who designed the creatures for the movie Alien. On a British Airways flight in 1995, a woman was complaining of chest pain, so 2 doctors came over to check on her. They quickly realized she was suffering from a punctured lung and required immediate surgery. But the problem was they couldn't land for help since the increase in air pressure could kill her. So they performed mid-air surgery on her using a coat hanger, silverware, and a bottle of cognac for sterilization. Within 10 minutes, they'd saved her life. In the summer of 2021, 40-year-old Jerry Smith was posing on Tinder as a woman named Angie Renee when he met 18-year-old football player Isemimen Itute. After they got together and went all the way with each other, Itute realized that Angie was a man. That's when the 6'3" linebacker stomped and beat the man to death. Just earlier this year, he was acquitted of all murder charges. This photo from the early 1900s shows nurses standing with mentally ill patients wrapped in wet linens. This treatment method was thought to be calming for patients, despite many of them constantly screaming to get out. Here's a 1989 photo of South African spear fisherman Gerjo van Niekerk showing off his recent bite mark from a great white. He told reporters, quote, "It was a 1 in a million freak accident." While diving near Cape Town just 2 months afterwards, Gerjo went missing until his shark-bitten leg washed ashore a few days later. In 2004, a Georgia man was found naked and beaten unconscious next to a dumpster behind a Burger King. He didn't have any possessions or ID on him and couldn't even remember his own name. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he recognized himself but realized he was about 20 years older than he thought. For the next decade, authorities struggled to identify the man despite TV coverage and a nationwide effort. Given the alias Benjamin Kyle, the man was unable to obtain employment without his social security number and therefore became homeless for several years. It wasn't until 2015 when he was finally identified through DNA testing as William Burgess Powell, born in 1948. But despite this discovery, there's still a 20-year gap in his life history with no documented records or anything he can remember. Prior to filming The Dark Knight, Heath Ledger locked himself in a hotel room and talked to only himself for 6 straight weeks. He said this helped him land more in the realm of a psychopath to prepare for his iconic role of the Joker. Many believe this extreme dedication was partially responsible for his accidental overdose on sleeping pills the next year. A horrific bungee cord injury caused this man's iris to completely collapse. Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma used to be the wealthiest black community in all of America. That was until 1921 when a mob of white supremacists attacked the community with the help of the National Guard. Using guns, explosives, and even airplanes, they decimated 35 square blocks of the neighborhood and murdered hundreds of African Americans. It's known today as the Black Wall Street Massacre. Octomom Nadia Suleman became notorious in 2009 when she had 8 babies as a result of in vitro fertilization. However, Nadia claimed that while she was heavily sedated, it was her fertility specialist that convinced her to have 12 embryos implanted in her at once. All of the babies miraculously survived, but the doctor had his license revoked for extreme malpractice. This violin was used by the lead member of the band that played on the Titanic. Just like in the movie, they continued playing as the ship went down. Former beauty queen Joyce McKinney made headlines in 1977 when she kidnapped 17-year-old Mormon boy Kirk Anderson from his church. According to Anderson, she chained him to her bed frame and forced him to be her sex slave for 3 straight days. But according to British law at the time, no crime of had been committed since the victim was male. In 1981, David Kerwin was driving through Yellowstone's hot springs with his friend Ronald Ratcliffe and Ronald's dog Moosey. At some point, they parked their car for a better look, but Moosey suddenly jumped into one of the hot springs and started yelping. Even though many people warned him not to jump into the near boiling water, David dove straight in and attempted to rescue the suffering dog. He grabbed Moosey and made it close to the edge before letting go and sinking until his friend pulled him back out. Immediately afterwards, David muttered, "That was stupid. How bad am I? That was a stupid thing I did." He was immediately blinded since the hot spring had melted his eyeballs, and when someone helped to pull his shoe off, his skin came off with it. He sustained third-degree burns over 100% of his body and died the next day after living his final hours in agonizing pain. Sadly, Moosey the dog also did not survive. Princess Diana didn't die immediately at the scene of her car accident, but instead died 5 hours later due to a tear in the pulmonary vein of her heart. She would have had an 80% chance of surviving the crash if she had just been wearing her seatbelt.
Male genital transplant surgeons typically exclude the testicles when performing a transplant. This is because the deceased donor would become the biological father of any future babies produced by that nutsack.
In 2018, American missionary John Allen Chow illegally traveled to North Sentinel Island so that he could preach Christianity to an uncontacted tribe. He was well aware that the Sentinelese people were extremely violent towards outsiders, but he believed that God would protect him. Before he even stepped foot on land, he was greeted with an arrow through the heart. Nicknamed the Merchant of Death, Russian arms dealer Victor Bout rose to power after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Using his fleet of 60 cargo planes, the arms he's brokered have helped fuel conflicts in countries including Afghanistan, Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, Rwanda, Liberia, Sudan, and Sierra Leone. Willing to sell weapons to anyone who wanted them, Bout has supplied both sides of multiple civil wars and is said to be responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people. He was arrested during a sting operation in 2008 where he was caught selling surface-to-air missiles that would have been used to kill American troops. But Victor Bout is now free thanks to a prisoner swap for WNBA player Brittany Griner, who was arrested 6 months ago after trying to bring a THC cartridge on a Russian airplane. This 1994 photo shows O.J. Simpson holding hands with his children at the funeral of their mother and his ex-wife Nicole Simpson Brown. She was brutally stabbed to death, most likely by O.J. himself, even though he was famously acquitted in court a few months later. During the funeral, O.J. reportedly spent a significant amount of time with Nicole's body and was even seen kissing her on the lips. Up until 1974, it was illegal to appear in public in the city of Chicago if you were ugly, and each offense was subject to a fine. The law was primarily made to prevent people with disabilities from going outside. While on his deathbed and completely unable to speak due to throat cancer, famous author Aldous Huxley wrote his final request to his wife to be given 100 micrograms of LSD. So she injected him with 2 separate doses of acid, and he died just a few hours later while tripping balls. When Eminem was a heavy user, he would swallow handfuls of pills without even knowing what they were. In 2007, he once overdosed on so much methadone that doctors informed him he was only 2 hours away from dying. It was such a wake-up call that he quit drugs almost immediately and has remained sober ever since. American soldier Henry Gunther was the last man to die during World War I. At 10:59 a.m. on November 11, 1918, he bravely charged at a German roadblock filled with armed soldiers. The Germans tried waving him off, knowing that the armistice would be signed within a few moments. But he apparently got too close, fired a couple rounds, and was killed instantly. In 1871, Ohio lawyer Clement Vallandigham was defending a client who was charged with murder. While showing the court how the victim might have accidentally shot himself, Clement accidentally shot himself. He won the case, but he died. According to his former doctor, Michael Jackson's father had him chemically castrated as a young boy. He reportedly did this so that Michael would maintain his high-pitched singing voice into adulthood. The skin of certain fish species can be grafted onto severe burns and diabetic wounds. The material recruits the body's own cells and is eventually converted into living tissue. Located in Paris, this is the tomb of legendary scientist Marie Curie. It's lined with an inch thick of lead since her remains are still radioactive to this day. A Nile crocodile named Gustave has killed as many as 300 people in Burundi over the last 50 years. He's evaded dozens of capture and murder attempts as he can be identified by the 3 bullet scars on his body. The 2,000-pound monster croc is already nearly 20 feet long and is said to be still growing to this day. Here's a 1997 photo of Las Vegas police facing Mike Tyson after he'd just bitten off the ear of Evander Holyfield during a boxing match. Tyson claimed he was in a primal, blacked-out state and literally wanted to kill his opponent. This fox drowned in a frozen lake and was cut out and displayed as a warning for people to keep off the ice. Just last week, an 88-year-old Frenchman caused an entire hospital to be evacuated for the strangest of reasons. He had a shell from World War I stuck inside of his anus, which the hospital considered to be a bomb threat, and a defusing team was called in. They determined the shell was not at risk of exploding and it was surgically removed by doctors.